But today we're going to talk about garden myths, and hopefully we were going to bust those garden myths for you um, today. So there's a lot of different areas of garden myths. I had to group them. There's a lot out there. So there's like 12. At this point, there's 12 categories, and we'll kind of go through these. There's probably two or three at least per category. And if you think of some other ones, you can definitely put those in the chat. But we're going to start with our soil because that seems to be the most mysterious part of our myth busting today. So I always hear, adding coffee grounds or pine needles helps acidify the soil. Well, that is true to a certain extent, but it doesn't change the pH because once you use those coffee grounds, the acidity went in your cup. They are then neutralized. Once they decompose, compost is usually at a neutral pH between 6 and 7. There might be a slight drop in soil pH until they decompose, but really not enough to damage your plants or to keep that pH down if you're looking for like blueberries and azaleas and things of that sort. They do make really good mulch. So that will suppress weeds and hold in moisture and then slowly add those nutrients back in as they break down. But if you're going to lower your pH, it might be easier and faster to use an acidifying agent like sulfur or sulfur-coated urea if you need some nitrogen, things of that sort. So don't put your coffee grounds in there. Put them in the compost pile where they belong. If you've ever been on any type of video, social media, they use bananas a lot. And they do add potassium to your soil. And that does stimulate plant growth and flower production, but they decompose really, really slowly that they may attract unwanted wildlife. Raccoons, possums, things of that sort that might eat them. But the amount of nitrogen that needs to be used to break down the banana peel makes that not available for your plant. So you might have less green plants until that gets totally disintegrated into your soil. Again, put your banana peels in the compost bin where they should be. Eggshells. People do a lot of things with eggshells. I was amazed when I was looking this up. They do include a lot of calcium, potassium, sodium, but to change the pH of your soil or to add calcium to your soil, you need a lot of eggshells. And they also may take years to add value to the garden. And even though if you crush them to a powder, they have not chemically decomposed enough to add calcium to your soil. Lime would be an easier way to do that. But you know what? Here in Kentucky, if you take a soil test, it tells you how much calcium's in the soil. We have a lot of calcium in our soil because it's based on limestone. So we probably don't need to add eggshells to our soils. It's good to recycle those and put them in the compost pile. And I did find a little fact that they've actually found eggshells in Neanderthal and prehistoric midden piles or prehistoric trash dumps. So even thousands and thousands of years later, those eggshells are still intact and they still know what they are for that. So put them in the compost pile, but just know that they're going to be there forever. Okay, soils again. Clay soil is always bad. People go, oh, I've got clay soil, I can't grow anything. Well, clay soil is actually a good thing to have in moderation. It happens to be the nutrient storehouse for your plants because of the particle surface and the chemical properties, which we don't have to go into. They hold all the nutrients. So you need a little bit of clay. If you have totally sandy soil, you're always adding those nutrients in. So it's not always bad. It's actually a good thing. But if you have heavy soils that they stay wet for long periods of time, adding compost to that soil will lighten it up a little bit and allow some oxygen and some air into it. But don't add sand because if you add sand and you don't add enough, you're going to get cement and it's going to be even worse. So don't add sand to clay. Keep the sand away and add some compost and some organic matter. That will make it better. Sand just makes it rock hard like concrete. So you do need a little bit of clay. Now, those heavy, mucky clay soils, yeah, they're hard to grow in. So we need to add some organic matter to that. Okay. Oh, the best way to plant is to fill a newly dug hole with soil amendments. Yeah, no, don't do that. We it can be harmful sometimes, especially if you put fertilizer in the hole. Fertilizer's a salt, and that can actually burn the roots that you may have on the outside of that root ball. It's better actually if you put that same soil back in the hole, and then add your organic matter and your mulch to over the top. And then you get the earthworms in there to help drag that organic matter into the soil. Um, I'm kind of a lazy gardener. This is what I do. Throw that dirt back in there. You could definitely water it in. And I like this photo right here because they've got a little bit of a slope to the edge. Their hole should be like 3 times as wide, which it looks like. It's planted about the same depth as see where the soil is right there. It was buried a little deep, but it's that first root comes off right there at the shovel handle. And they could actually dig it a little bit deeper if they needed to, just to get that even with the soil. And then make sure your mulch is over the top, but don't add organic matter or peat moss or anything else to that hole, especially for your trees and your shrubs that are going to be there for years and years and years. All righty. Okay. Next. Oh, we already talked a little bit about this one. Adding sand to loosen heavy clay soil. It's the worst remedy. It turns it rock hard. Use your organic matter. Sand can improve. It can improve a soil, and that's kind of where the myth came from. But you have to add just as much sand as there is clay. So if you have a football field's worth of sand, or sorry, clay, you need to put and it's 8 inches deep, you need to put 8 inches of sand on the top of that. And then that way, if you look at your soil, it will kind of loosen that up. But you've got to have even amounts of sand and clay. And here on the next slide, I'll show you. If you look here, you've got, oops, haha, I've got a laser pointer. So here's clay, and up to 40% clay is a lot of clay. If you're looking at 50%, oops, percent clay, here we go. 50% clay, you're still here. You just need a little bit of clay for here, but you're still looking at this clay loam. So texture is how the soil feels when it's worked. So if it's clayey, it'll have like a slick, thick feel to it when you use it between your thumb and your forefinger. If it's more sandy, you'll feel that little grit. And if you do there's a ribbon test you can try. And if your ribbon goes past your 4 fingers of your fist, then that's a clayey soil. If it breaks off at 1 or 2 knuckles, then go ahead, that's a more sandy, silty texture. So it's how texture is how it feels. Structure is the percentage is the aggregation of particles with organic matter. So that's how the soil structure is. Is it blocky? Is it platy? Sometimes clay can be kind of flaky when it's drier. And the percentage kind of has its water holding capacity, and the structure affects the moisture availability through the soil in movement. So if it's a blocky texture or structure, sorry, I'm getting those confused myself, then the water filtrates in fairly easily. If it's platy, like a deck of cards is platy, then that's going to be a little bit harder for that water to penetrate through. And that happens with our clay soils. So the addition of organic matter can improve your structure, but it cannot change your texture. I hope that makes sense for everybody. And then, but this soil triangle is what all soil scientists love to talk about. And it takes a little bit of time to figure that out. So don't worry if you don't understand the soil triangle. We can talked about that in the at the end. Okay, we've moved on from soil to pests. Yay! So there's lots of myths about pesticides and what's better and what's ever. The myth is organic pesticides are always safer than synthetic. In fact, Natural or organic does not always mean safer or better. Um, Take nicotine sulfate for instance. That's an insecticide that's derived from tobacco. It's extremely toxic to humans and other animals if you absorb it through your skin. So if you've ever worked on a tobacco farm and you got tobacco sickness, that's what you had. I always start with the least toxic control option available and then read product labels closely and precautions very closely. Another common insecticide, rotenone, is derived from the root of a tropical bean, but it's considerably more toxic than its synthetic equivalent. The reason that they're organic is that they break down fairly rapidly, so that the biggest hazard to people and wildlife is at the time of application. So usually the synthetics last a little longer, but the organic ones tend to break down fairly quickly. So read the labels, look for caution on the label. Those are the least toxic control options, and use according to the label directions. But organic doesn't always mean safer. And I always tell people poison ivy is a natural oil. I definitely don't want it in my shampoo. So just keep that in mind for those. So that's another thing. So dish soap is a natural, safe alternative to pesticides. No, sorry, busted. Dish soaps, like detergents, are man-made. They're detergents designed to be powerful chemical cleanser and degreasers. Insecticidal soaps are made to use on plants that can kill insects. Dish soaps are usually fairly harsh and they take that waxy layer off the leaves. And University of Florida has done extensive research on that. They're largely bogus. Many liquid dish soaps aren't even soap. They're a dishwashing liquid, and they can destroy a plant's leaves if they're sprayed on them. So insecticidal soaps are a little easier to use, and they're regulated by the EPA for that. And they do a fairly good job, and they're fairly short-lived in the environment. So use an insecticidal soap as opposed to making your own concoction. I had to look this one up. This was about marigolds and nematodes. It is true. Marigolds can deter nematodes, but simply planting them alongside another crop has not been shown to reduce nematode populations. You have to plant them as a cover crop at least 2 months before planting the desired crop. And the cost of these seeds are pretty expensive. Not all marigolds produce enough alpha terrathenol, not saying that correctly, to control the population. So we haven't picked the ones that are the best at producing that chemical. Some populations actually increase in the presence of marigolds, which is kind of not what we wanted to do. And then you actually have to till the marigold plants or byproducts into the soil. Oh, sorry, tilling them into the soil is not very effective either because it's only produced in a living marigold root. So as much as we would love to think that they're magic, they are not. So they can reduce certain populations of parasitic nematodes, but probably not well enough for us to use them as a control measure. So I'm sorry. Nematodes are going to be there to stay. Oh, our friend the mole. We love the moles. But vibrations, mothballs, fruity gum does not deter moles. They tunnel right next to the highways. So 18-wheel trucks don't bother them. If you have mothballs in there, they'll probably just wall off that tunnel. And University of Florida also did research on this. They'll block off the treated tunnel, but will happily dig a tunnel a few feet away. They're not sure if they believe gum is toxic to moles or if the smell alone will do the trick. Regardless, it's not supported. But yes, it's true that mothballs are obnoxious to most creatures, but there's no real good methods of eliminating them that do not endanger these furry creatures. But guess what? You've got a healthy, thriving ecosystem. So they're eating the earthworms and insects that are in your soil. Most plants recover quickly if you kind of step on them before they dry out too much. unless you have a dog, and sometimes the dogs will eat the moles. So, but none of the other deterrents will do a good job. They are fairly territorial, so they like about an acre per mole. They did find that at the University of Kentucky. So, do you have to stake your newly planted trees? It can hinder its development if you're not careful. Um, this one got really staked well. I don't know that I would have put all of that on that poor young tree. But we do need to allow it to sway in the wind. It encourages those stronger stabilizing roots on that in that root ball. And yeah, I would it was a standard, and usually people want to help those trees out. Unless it's grown in a really windy location or on a slope. At that point, you probably could stake it, but you want to make sure that you take that off within a year. Tie it very loosely from the stakes, and using fabric such as t-shirts or inner tube tires to avoid damaging the bark. I see a lot of trees that have a ring where they were staked and they weren't not let go very quickly. So yeah, you want to let them sway in the wind and do what they need to do to establish themselves. Dig the hole twice as wide and twice as deep as the root ball. No, it should be twice as wide, but no deeper. We don't have to dig a hole to China, thank goodness, because we have heavy soils and that soil is heavy. But make sure you make it wide enough because your roots are going to spread out laterally. Place the top roots so that they're parallel with the soil surface, and then apply 2 inches of mulch over the top of that. Think of a planting area, then a hole, and then don't backfill like we had talked about before, because the roots are lazy and they'll tend to circle around in that amended soil and not spread out into the rest of the landscape. And for trees, that's especially hard because if they're just in that one little hole, they tend to fall over in a windstorm or in an ice storm that we may have over the winter time or in the early spring when our soils are really, really saturated with water. Let's see. Oh, we've gone on to weeds. I love weeds. Vinegar is an effective weed killer. It may kill weeds because it's caustic, but it's going to kill the top of the weed. It's not going to go into the root system and kill the root system. And if you buy weed killing or herbicidal vinegar, which is it's 20% acetic acid, and most of what you can find in the stores is 5%, which you use for salad dressings and pickling and things of that sort, preserving. It's the difference between 5 and 20%. The problem with acetic acid for weed control is it can cause permanent eye damage if you get that in your eye. You've basically, scarred your eye for that. And if you keep adding vinegar to your soil, you run the risk of acidifying it because that's what vinegar does. It's an acidifier. So it probably will burn down the top of some annual weeds, but it won't move anywhere else for perennial weeds. And you need about 5 times as much acidity. Oh, I love landscape fabric is not a permanent solution for weed control. Especially if you have organic mulch over the top, because that will, the seeds will land right in there and they will start to grow. And sometimes the roots will come right up of your trees and shrubs that are in that bed, will come right up to the bottom of that fabric, and be vulnerable to droughts or flooding at that point. And it's on this one, it needs to be cut away from the trunk of the tree. It's good to keep your rocks and non-organic mulches out of your soil. If it's exposed, it can degrade pretty quickly in a year. And then it becomes a maintenance headache. You can reduce your weeds. Organic mulches are best as they improve the improve your soil texture and health, and can be replenished as needed. So I would very carefully use landscape fabrics in certain situations, but not necessarily as the end all be all of weed control, because they're really not weed control solutions. They're more like to keep your rock out of your soils or your other inorganic mulches. They're really good underneath rubber mulch too. Diseases, we've moved into diseases. I think I only have one disease. Baking soda helps control powdery mildew. It can help. However, the problem is that you're adding salt to your plants in your soil because sodium bicarbonate has sodium in it. You have to apply it multiple times. And sometimes this is in with like a neem oil as a kind of a sticker. And you can actually, if you're not careful, burn your foliage. It might work in the short term if you have a little bit of powdery mildew, but it's not a long-term solution to control that. So we may need to thin out our plant material. We may need to add some light into that. We may need to change our mulch. But yeah, baking soda, limited effect, I would say. Pruning. This one still gets me. We haven't actually recommended this for like 30 years to paint our pruning cuts. If you prune properly, trees will heal themselves, and they really don't heal like we do. They kind of like compartmentalize and cover over. And they kind of give out, when they compartmentalize, they release chemicals into the wood that is not pleasant for insects or diseases to get into. It's their own natural process. So it isolates the wound and chemically repels invasion. Make proper pruning cuts. If you've got a disease already in there and you don't want to sterilize your tools, make sure your tools are sharp, and prune usually in the early spring before things start to kind of go. So you've got that flush of growth to help cover over. And for this poor little tree, I would have probably cut, as weird as it sounds, I probably would have cut this one down a little bit farther down here, because that's where all of the good, you can even see the little roll of callus where that is going to grow to cover over that little hole or the big hole, depending. But don't paint your pruning cuts. And actually, the moisture that gets behind this paint can actually cause disease, and then you'll get a hole into your trunk. And if you ever knew who Tom Barnes was, he said if you ever want to make a critter cave in your tree, is to flush cut your tree and then paint the wound. He said that's the best way to get a cavity in your tree, which we don't really want in our trees. It shortens their lifespan. You need to top a tree to control its height. Well, sure, especially if you want that tree to be horizontal in a few years. It does definitely shorten the life of the tree. And trees are programmed, or genetically programmed, to attain a certain height. So be careful when you plant a tree that you make sure that that height is not too tall. And it only temporarily delays the inevitable. And it does that tree's going to die a little bit faster than you think. It does result in this sucker growth, or sometimes I call it, lion tail, where it kind of gets bushy at the top, because that tree is trying to put on enough leaf to feed its root system. And they're weakly attached. They're going to fall off anyway. And it can't really use that architecture of a tree to seal that wound. There's not a good layer of cells that are going to cover over the top of that wound, and they get water in the top, and it just makes a big hole in there. And they're persistent. They want to live, but topping is not. And I see this all the time. I do, and I wish we would stop, because it just makes me sad. Oh, we're into vegetables. How many of y'all have heard that spreading crushed eggshells in the vegetable garden cures blossom end rot? I've heard it. People told me they've Googled it. Again, they don't like break down very quickly. They stay intact pretty well. But really, this blossom end rot is almost it's an overwatering problem, or an underwatering or uneven watering problem. and it's soil moisture and temperature and caused by erratic watering. So if you kind of, if your tomatoes are in a container, that's really easy to control because you can water that every day. Calcium sprayed on the are also ineffective because calcium can't be sprayed in through the tomato skins. It doesn't come in through the leaves, and it doesn't move into the fruit from the foliage. So you want to fertilize your tomatoes in containers with a complete fertilizer, probably if it's a liquid fertilizer, every time you water. And if you're watering every day, you only need a little, I would go down to like half strength. But if they're in the ground, take a soil test, find out what you have. I can pretty much assure you that at least in Hardin County, where I've seen a lot of soil tests, we don't have calcium deficient soils. So it's an uneven watering problem 99% of the time. But eggshells are not going to do it. It might make you happy to put them out there, but they're not going to do a darn thing for your tomatoes. Suckering. I did not realize how controversial a topic suckering tomatoes is. I leave all the suckers on my plant because the one time I did sucker, I was young and I pulled off all the leaves. So that was not a good idea. So you can prune your suckers to result in larger fruit if you've got a larger fruiting tomato, but you only want to prune your suckers off of indeterminate tomatoes. So they're going to continue to grow. If you have like a sauce tomato, like a Roma, what they do is they grow to a height and then they bloom and put all their fruit on at one time. So you have enough to process. But if you've got a beefsteak or say some cherry tomatoes, you can remove the suckers from them just fine because they will continue to put on leaves at that. But they're easy if you want to, but you don't have to. I'm one of those lazy gardeners. If I don't have to do something, you want to snap it off right here at the orange arrows in that leaf axil right there. You can prune on a sunny, dry day so that the wounds heal pretty quickly and you don't get a disease in there. So you don't have to, but you can. It's not going to hurt anything. Oh, this is containers. And this goes for indoor plants, outdoor plants, any type of plant that has a container. To put rocks or shards in the bottom to improve the drainage. That's the key factor there. In fact, that's not true. It's actually harder for water to move from this fine grain soil, such as the potting mix, to a coarser material like gravel, because what happens is that this whole volume of soil has to be saturated with no air bubbles in it so that it will drain into the next layer. So by putting pebbles, you're actually encouraging a waterlogged soil that you're trying to prevent. If you want to, you can elevate the bottom of this so it can drain out fairly easy at the bottom, but I would fill this all the way with planting mix. If you feel like your soil is going to flow out of the bottom, put a little piece of like coffee filter or something in the bottom that will allow water to go through, but you don't want to put a big lot of rocks in the bottom. Now, I didn't say anything about making that pot heavy so it doesn't fall over. This is just for the drainage issue at the bottom. If you have a big pot, it's going to take a lot of potting soil to fill up. And you don't ever want to put like regular garden soil in there from your vegetable garden outside. Oh, apparently Epsom salts is the cure-all end-all of everything that you need. They do provide magnesium and sulfur. But if your plants aren't magnesium deficient, it won't help them grow. They're soluble, so they dissipate in the soil that receives irrigation or rainfall. But it could pollute the groundwater with magnesium salts. But if they're in the soil, we tend not to have magnesium deficiencies. But you need a slower release source of magnesium as opposed to Epsom salts. And then most of the magnesium deficiencies occur in highly cultivated soils or sandy soils, which we don't have here in central Kentucky. But and you'll see this chlorosis in older leaves if you have a magnesium deficient plant. But normally Epsom salts keep that for your foot soaks and your baths. Um, or if you've got a sprained ankle, that works really well. If a little fertilizer is good, twice as much is better. Um, again, fertilizers are salts, so you can actually burn the roots and lead to plant decline. And if we get a drought period, it's going to take a lot. It's it's going to take a less much of a drought stress to cause stress in your plants, because if you've got really salty soil, the salt in the soil can actually pull moisture out of your root systems when water becomes limiting. So you want to make sure that you don't over fertilize your soil. It's much harder to fix a over fertilized soil than it is an under fertilized soil, because it's really hard to crop that fertilizer off and use it up out of the soil. And usually just a little bit of compost with a little bit of fertilizer is all they need. But take a soil test. They're mostly free in the state. Okay. Wilting always indicates a plant needs water. Well, sometimes, yes. But if I saw that on my plant, I would check and see if my soil is dry. I would stick my finger in there, and yes, that looks like pretty dry soil. But also waterlogged soils can can cause wilting. So you're like, well, how do we know? You can also have, if it got too moist at one point or too wet, you could get a root rot in there, and then the roots aren't functioning, and that will cause a wilt. Other insects, nematodes, gophers can feed on the roots. That pesky mold can have run under there and kind of slice the roots off of there. Excess salts in your soil or over fertilizing can also cause wilt. So there's other ways, other reasons why your plant may be wilting. So don't always go and grab the water hose for that. I've heard this just the other day, and I was like, that doesn't seem right. Your water on plant leaves can cause the leaves to burn. No, not really. Burn marks can be fungal or bacterial if there's a disease on there. Sometimes plant roots have absorbed substances that manifest itself on the plant leaf. Sometimes there's, especially in houseplants, you'll get little water droplets along the edge, but it won't burn the leaf if the sun shines through that droplet. Leaves are pretty resilient for that, because you know what? After a rainstorm, usually the sun comes out. And they tend to shed that water pretty quickly for that. Oh man, has anybody else done this? Water your orchid with ice cubes each week. Ice and orchids do not mix. Orchids are tropical plants. It does not like to be below like 55 degrees, sometimes 60 degrees, and putting frozen water on those root systems are not good. And it can cause your aerial roots or your root systems to turn brown. Just use regular water. And usually I just leave a pitcher of water on my desk so I can water my orchids. It's also a good idea to let that chlorine evaporate off of your water before you water your plants. Some plants, house plants especially, are very sensitive to that, but don't ever use an ice cube. I know it says it on the tag. It tells you how to water it on the tag, and it says place 2 ice cubes every 3 or 4 days. Don't do it. Yeah, you can melt the ice cubes, that'd be fine, but put the water on the plant. Okay. Lawns are low maintenance. Oh, I only have to mow that once a week. They're pretty maintenance hogs, because if you're gonna keep it looking good, and let me tell you, I haven't seen a lot of good looking lawns in the past couple of weeks, but you have to water it, maybe a lot. You got to mow, and then you got to fertilize, and then you got to edge and aerate and weed. And that's just the ongoing maintenance. I have a lot of weeds in mine, so if I want to reseed and get the weeds out, and trap the underground varmint if I need to, and so plant some shrubs or plant some wildflowers or another garden. I'm not going to say that nobody needs any type of lawn. I do kind of like my lawn in the front yard, but it's not perfect. And there's high level maintenance, and then there's low level maintenance. But they're not low. If you want to be better than the Joneses, you gotta be up there. And sometimes you have to, you have to buy the mower. You have to buy the gas. And grass clippings left on the lawn causes thatch. No, not really. Um, Thatch is usually living and dead organic matter that settled into the grass, or on the ground. And this is a pretty thick layer of thatch. It's about 3.5 centimeters tall. Um, Clippings are pretty high in water, so they break down pretty quickly. If you let your grass grow too long, like I do sometimes, I usually have to mow over it a couple of times or get one of those not thatching, recycling, composting, not composting. I'm thinking of a word. You're going to yell it at me later. Um, Mulching mowers. That's it. It's a mulching mower. And then that one breaks it up pretty quickly. Usually if you have excessive thatch over a half-inch thick, creates, pest and disease can get in there. If it mostly happens if you water and fertilize more, because you get more grass growth. And then that causes inhibition of the decomposition of the organic matter at ground level. So you want your organic matter to be down here, and your thatch probably could be just a little 2.5. Oh, maybe, well, probably this is centimeters, looks like. Yeah, metric. So a centimeter or two is fine, but once it gets above that at almost 3.5 centimeters, you're really going to have a hard time getting that to go. And then you got to go through it and you got to cut it up. You can't burn it. It doesn't burn. But you got to take care of it with a dethatcher. Otherwise, your grass is just going to, grow a little bit at a time. Oh, I love this one, bulbs. Bulbs, you got to braid those bulb leaves to make them look nice. You don't have to. Part of the leaf that is not exposed to the sun won't store energy for that bulb for the future flowers. So if you've got, I know sometimes gardens do this. It restricts the photosynthesis. You're not going to get as many flowers, or your bulbs, they may actually die if they don't get enough nutrients if you don't let them go. I kind of let mine go, and I figure out what kind of plant will grow over the top of that. So I have hostas that come up over the top of my bulbs. In the sunnier locations, I have some of those early spring candy tufts, and sometimes I get some poppies and things like that you want something to grow over the top. And usually daffodils and tulips and things will last a long time if they get enough nutrients to recharge their bulb out there. Okay. Ooh, I'm on time. Let's see. Okay. So here are my resources. I looked at University of California. University of Florida has like 3 publication sheets on garden myths, and there was a bunch at the Missouri Botanical Garden under their environmental practices page. So they had a really good list of that. But University of Florida was by far the most comprehensive. If you need to get a hold of me, those are my digits. So hopefully we will have some questions and answers at the end. I'm going to end slideshow and